Everyone knows the tallest mountain in the world, and everyone is wrong, at least partly. Because the question, which mountain is the highest, doesn't have one answer, it has at least three, and everything depends on where you start counting from. Measured from sea level, Everest wins. But measured from the center of the Earth, the champion is an extinct volcano in Ecuador that almost nobody has heard of, even though it stands in plain sight. Its name is Chimborazo, and it isn't just the closest point on the planet to the stars. It's also a mountain that, for nearly 30 years, hid an entire passenger plane beneath its glacier, with 59 people on board. And to understand how an unremarkable volcano managed to outdo Everest, we have to start with a simple question. What does the height of a mountain even mean? At first glance, it sounds silly. Just measure from the base to the summit, and that's the end of it. But it's in this apparent simplicity that the whole puzzle hides. From the base, from where, exactly? From the foot that disappears underwater? From sea level? From the center of the planet? Once you start thinking about it, it turns out that a mountain has no single, fixed, once-and-for-all height at all. There are several honest ways to measure it, and each one crowns a different mountain. By one ruler, one champion sits on the throne. Change your starting point, and a completely different summit rises to the top. Not because anyone is hiding it from us, it's just that, since childhood, we've grown used to one single measuring stick, and we don't even suspect there are several. And that's how it happens that a mountain taller than Everest can stand right in front of us. Tourists climb its slopes every single year and still remain completely unknown. The very mountain that knows how to hide not only a crashed airplane, but its own title. Next, we'll walk through these rulers one by one and see which summit each of them crowns. And along the way, we'll dig up the story of that quiet champion, a story with plenty of real science and plenty of genuine tragedy in it. But we have to begin with the mountain whose name every schoolchild knows: Everest. Its height is printed in reference books. It's the yardstick for everything else on the planet. And behind that familiar number hides that very question. How do you even measure the height of a mountain? Usually, from sea level. You take a conventional zero mark, the average level of the ocean, and you look at how far the summit rises above it, straight up. By this ruler, Everest stretches to 8,848 meters and 86 centimeters, higher than any other point of land on Earth, and that's why it's called the highest mountain in the world. But even that number turned out to be less solid than it seems. For years, China and Nepal couldn't agree on how tall Everest actually is. The dispute was about the summit. Do you count the snow cap that crowns the mountain or the solid rock beneath it? The difference was noticeable, almost 4.5 meters, an entire floor that either exists or doesn't. Only in the year 2020 did the two countries announce the height together for the first time, and they settled on the snow-capped measurement. And this is where it's worth slowing down. Above sea level seems like the only sensible way to measure a mountain, but it's just one option, simply the most familiar one. Shift the starting point, ask the question a little differently, and Everest's unshakable throne begins to wobble. There's a mountain that, in its own way, is taller. To see it, you have to go all the way down to its base, to the ocean floor. Here it's serious. This mountain's lower half is hidden underwater. Start counting not from the surface of the ocean, but from its true foundation. And the champion changes, and it stands in a place where nobody thinks to look for mountains, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This is Mauna Kea, a volcano in the Hawaiian Islands. From the outside, it's just a large mountain, rising a little more than 4 kilometers above the water. But what you see above the waves is only the tip. Mauna Kea's real foundation lies deep on the ocean floor, and from there to the summit, it measures about 10,200 meters. Only the smaller part sticks up above the water. Everything else is hidden beneath the mass of the ocean, like an iceberg. Let's compare fairly by one and the same ruler. If you measure from base to summit, Everest comes out to about 4,500 meters. After all, it doesn't stand at sea level, but on the high Tibetan Plateau. Mauna Kea, from base to top, is twice that. In other words, as a single mountain, from the very bottom to the very top, the Hawaiian volcano is nearly twice as tall as Everest. True, this ruler has a weak spot, and it's worth being honest about. Exactly where the mountain ends and the ocean floor begins has never been strictly defined by anyone. The base is a fuzzy notion. Shift it by a couple hundred meters and the result drifts. But even with that caveat, one thing is clear. The highest is no longer only about Everest. And now, let's make the problem harder once more. The third method skips the ocean entirely. You take a mountain whose base and summit both lie above sea level, and you count the pure rise from bottom to top. And a new hero steps onto the stage. By this measure, the frontrunner is Denali, the highest mountain in North America in Alaska. Above sea level, it falls short of many giants, but its slopes climb from base to summit by roughly 5,500 meters, almost without a break. That's the greatest continuous rise of any mountain on the planet that lies entirely above water, more than even Everest gives from its own high foundation. Stand at the foot of Denali, and above you rises a solid wall over 5 kilometers tall. And the further this race goes, the stranger its winners become. Beyond Earth, the familiar numbers fall apart altogether. Out there, the height of mountains is measured not in meters, but in tens of kilometers. The volcano Olympus Mons on Mars rises about 22 kilometers, nearly 2.5 times higher than Everest, a whole mountain the size of a small country. And even it has a rival, a peak in the middle of a giant crater on the asteroid Vesta, which competes with Olympus Mons for the title of the tallest mountain in the entire solar system. But the strangest champion on this list is not on Mars, and not on some distant asteroid. It's back here, on Earth. A mountain that, by one honest measure, beats both Everest and everyone else, and one that, at the same time, almost nobody has ever heard of. Its name is Chimborazo, an extinct volcano in the Ecuadorian Andes. The measure by which it beats everyone is the most unexpected of all, the distance not from sea level and not from the base, but from the summit to the center of the Earth. To understand how it wins by that ruler, we have to remember that our planet is not a perfect sphere at all. The Earth spins, and that spinning makes it bulge slightly at the equator, like a soft ball pressed down from above. The difference is enormous. At the equator, the planet's surface sits about 21 kilometers farther from the center than it does at the poles. Any mountain standing near the equator gets that head start simply for the place where it was born. And Chimborazo stands almost right on the equator, just 1.5 degrees away from it. And here's where the trick begins. Above sea level, the summit of Chimborazo is more than 2.5 kilometers lower than Everest, a huge gap, and not at all in its favor. But start measuring from the center of the planet, and everything flips. That same summit turns out to be farther from the center of the Earth than the peak of Everest by about 2 kilometers, which means we're looking at the most distant point from the center of the entire planet, and the closest piece of land on Earth to the stars. A person standing on Chimborazo is farther from the heart of the Earth than any conqueror of Everest. True, it isn't the only champion of its kind. Because of that same equatorial bulge, dozens of other peaks also reach farther from the center than Everest, and among them is even far-off Kilimanjaro in Africa. And breathing down Chimborazo's neck is Peru's Huascarán, trailing by only a few dozen meters. But first on that list is precisely the Ecuadorian volcano. And it has a long past, one far louder than its quiet fame today. There was a time when the whole world was measured against its name. 200 years ago, geographers and travelers had no doubt. Before them stood the highest mountain on the entire planet. No rivals, simply the tallest summit humanity knew. Chimborazo held that title until Europeans finally reached the Himalayas with their measuring instruments. When they calculated the height of the peaks there, the Ecuadorian volcano toppled from its pedestal. Next to Everest and its neighbors, it turned out to be almost 3 kilometers lower. The king was dethroned and nearly forgotten. And here's the irony. A full century before that fall, an expedition came to the foot of that very mountain, one that would overturn how people understood the shape of the planet. In the 1730s, scientists set out from France to the equator with one single question. What shape is the Earth really? Back in Europe, the argument was fierce. Some believed the planet was flattened at the poles, others that, on the contrary, it was stretched out like an egg. The only way to settle it was with measurements on site, right at the equator. The scientists set up camps in the Andes, on the slopes of Chimborazo, and for years they measured the curvature of the Earth's surface. Their calculations confirmed it. The planet is flattened at the poles and bulges at the equator. And here, the loop closes. The mountain helped prove the very bulge of the Earth, and centuries later, It is exactly that bulge that makes Chimborazo the champion, the farthest point on the planet from its center. In a sense, the mountain helped crown itself. And the first person to try to climb it in the name of science was a man ready to risk his life for knowledge. Alexander von Humboldt, a German naturalist obsessed with the desire to measure and understand the entire world. In the year 1802, he was climbing the slopes of Chimborazo, still believing he was assaulting the highest mountain on the planet. For him, the ascent wasn't a sport, it was an experiment as long as the whole mountain. With two companions, he climbed higher and higher, into a place where no European had ever gone, with scientific instruments in hand. They reached about 5,875 meters, higher than anyone had ever climbed in that era. It was a record that stood for decades. Not much remained to the summit, but there was no way forward. The path was cut off by a deep chasm, and their bodies were already failing. And this is where the mountain turned into a laboratory. Humboldt felt the thin air squeezing the strength out of him. Nausea crept in, his head spun, and other symptoms of altitude made themselves known. Anyone else would simply have turned back, but he observed his own body as if it were a test subject. He linked the sickness to the drop in air pressure at altitude, and, in effect, described altitude sickness in the language of science. So, it was on the slopes of an Ecuadorian volcano that the understanding of how altitude kills a human being was born. Humboldt came down alive, and he carried away from the mountain not only a record, but an insight that would outlive him. Altitude here is truly dangerous. He couldn't have known just how prophetic that thought would prove. Decades would pass, and Chimborazo would prove it again and again, no longer through a scientist's observation, but through human lives. But before that, the first person would finally reach the summit, and bring with him the shadow of someone else's old tragedy. The first to set foot on Chimborazo's summit was an Englishman, Edward Whymper. It happened only in January of 1880, almost 80 years after Humboldt. He wasn't alone. Two guides who shared the same surname, Carrel, climbed the mountain with him, and Whymper didn't launch the whole expedition for the glory of being first, but for the science Humboldt had begun, to study how altitude affects the human body. But Edward Whymper's name already thundered across all of Europe, and it thundered tragically. 15 years before Chimborazo, it was he who first in history conquered the Matterhorn, that fearsome peak in the Alps. That ascent became legend, but not only for its triumph. On the descent from the summit, 4 of his companions fell and were killed, a disaster that haunted Whymper for the rest of his life. And the shadow of that tragedy rose with him onto Chimborazo. His chief guide, Jean-Antoine Carrel, had been Whymper's old rival back on the Matterhorn. Once, the two of them had raced each other toward that alpine summit. Now, years later, yesterday's rivals stood shoulder to shoulder on another continent. Carl's own fate would match the mountains he gave his life to. In time, he would die of exhaustion on that same Matterhorn, using his last strength to lead his clients out of a deadly storm. So, even the triumph on Chimborazo carried the mark of death. The conquerors climbed with the weight of other people's tragedies on their backs, and Whymper himself had to prove his ascent twice. Critics didn't believe he had really been on the summit, and that same year he climbed again by a different route. He knew he had been there, but the mountain's truly dark fame was still ahead, and it began with a mystery that Chimborazo kept hidden for almost 30 years. And it all started in the sky. In August of 1976, an ordinary passenger flight was crossing Ecuador, from the capital, Quito, heading south to the city of Cuenca. There were 59 people on board. The route passed close to Chimborazo, and somewhere there, among the clouds and the snowy slopes, the plane vanished. It sent no distress signal, left no trace. It simply dissolved in broad daylight. They searched for it. Months went by, then years, and around the disappearance swarmed theories, each more incredible than the last. People spoke of a hijacking and a secret escape abroad. Some seriously brought up abduction by aliens. 59 people had seemingly been wiped off the face of the earth, and no one could explain it. The answer came only in the year 2003, almost 27 years after the disappearance. The wreckage was found high on the slope of Chimborazo, at an altitude of 5,310 meters. All that time, the glacier had concealed it. By one account, soon after the crash, an avalanche swept over the slope and hid the plane from any eyes. The mountain had literally buried it beneath its own ice. Beside the wreckage lay the bodies of all 59 people, and also newspapers from the very day the flight took to the sky, and the passengers' documents, as if time on that slope had frozen in 1976. It was decided not to disturb the dead and to leave them where they lay. For nearly 3 decades, an entire disaster had lain in plain sight, a few hours' walk from the tourist trails, and no one knew about it. But the plane was only one of the mountain's tragedies. The others played out far closer to the summit and took the lives of those who came here of their own free will. The mountain is considered accessible. Well-worn routes lead to the summit, and hundreds of climbers come here. And it's this deceptive ease that trips it up. The very same slope turned into a trap again and again. On the 10th of November, 1993, an avalanche broke loose just below the summit. At that moment, several rope teams of climbers were on the slope, some going up, some already starting down. The mass of snow buried them all and swept them into a glacial crevasse. 10 people died, 6 Frenchmen, 3 Ecuadorian guides, and a Swiss climber. To find the bodies, about 20 rescuers went up the mountain, and the work took 10 days. It became the worst tragedy in the history of Ecuadorian mountaineering. It seemed the lesson had been learned, but the mountain seemed to be biding its time. 28 years later, in October of 2021, the same slope let go again, almost at the exact same spot as in '93. An avalanche buried a group of climbers near the false summit, and 6 more died. One section of a mountain, 2 disasters nearly 3 decades apart, 16 lives in total. And there's something chilling in that repetition. Not a rare accident, not a fatal coincidence, but one specific place that kills by one and the same pattern, the moment people forget to be careful. The mountain didn't grow crueler over the years. It's just that snow, slope, and altitude work here as reliably as they did a century ago. But Chimborazo has another trait too, the quietest and the most haunting. It holds on to its dead for a long time, and then it begins to give them back. Those 10 who died in the avalanche of 1993, the ice took for a long time. The bodies stayed somewhere deep in the glacier, and for years, Chimborazo closed over them, as if they had never been. 22 years passed. In 2015, at an altitude of about 5,600 meters, the remains of 3 climbers were found on the slope. The very same people, 3 Ecuadorian guides who had died in that old avalanche. The ice had preserved them, slowly slid downhill, and carried them back to the living 2 decades later. They were identified, returned to their families, and at last a plaque was set on the mountain with the names of all 10 who had died. And it's not a one-time story. Between 2 high-altitude refugees on Chimborazo, there's a real cemetery. The gravestones of those the slopes never returned, or returned too late. The mountain people climb for records, and beautiful views keeps on its flanks a long list of those who never came back down. And now the glaciers of Chimborazo are melting, as they are everywhere on the planet. And with each passing year, the ice gives up what it hid for decades: wreckage, belongings, bodies. The mountain that reaches farthest of all toward the stars holds its dead the tightest, and lets them go only when it decides to. That's Chimborazo in a nutshell: quiet, forgotten, underrated, and yet a champion in 2 senses at once that almost no one suspects. And all of this brings us back to the question we started with. So, which mountain really is the highest on Earth? After everything we've seen, there's only one honest answer. It depends on which ruler you measure with. Take the familiar one, from sea level, and Everest wins, the king everyone knows. Start counting from base to summit, and Mauna Kea comes out ahead, the iceberg mountain that hides 4/5 of its height beneath the ocean. Measure the pure rise of a slope on dry land, and Denali in Alaska takes the lead. And stretch your ruler from the summit to the center of the planet, and the champion becomes the forgotten Ecuadorian volcano, Chimborazo, the closest point on Earth to the stars. 4 mountains, 4 legitimate answers. And it turns out that the highest isn't a fact carved in stone at all, but simply a choice of where to start measuring. We're used to thinking the world has one right answer to such a simple question. But it has several, and all of them are true. It isn't the mountain that changes, it's the ruler in our hands. But of all these champions, the most astonishing is precisely the one nobody talks about. A mountain visible from cities, with roads leading up to it. A mountain that reached farther into space than any other, and yet hid an entire airplane beneath its ice. A mountain whose slope killed twice, and which for decades refused to let go of its dead. Everyone knows Everest, but the one truly worth getting to know is Chimborazo, a quiet record holder, standing in plain sight of us all.